Helen sat on the small wooden porch, a testament to salvaged lumber and stubborn nails. The metal flank of her home, the old Pullman car, was warm from the late afternoon sun. Below her, a garden of impossible vibrancy grew in raised beds alongside the disused railway tracks. Tomatoes swelled on their vines, and the scent of basil mixed with the faint, ever-present aroma of creosote and hot steel. In the car behind hers, a baggage car they had christened the Annex, the low hum of a sewing machine kept a gentle rhythm. In the one beyond that, laughter spilled from an open window. She held a cup of chamomile tea, its warmth seeping into her 76-year-old hands. She was home. It was a strange, improbable home, a kingdom of rust and redemption built on a foundation of absolute ruin. To the world, she had been a ghost, a statistic, an elderly woman abandoned at a bus station with $17 and a silent telephone. But in this forgotten sliver of the world, on this dead-end siding, she was a queen. To understand how a woman with nothing could build a world from a single discarded railroad car, you have to go back. You have to go back to the day the world ended, so a new one could begin. The house was quiet. It had been quiet for 6 months, ever since Frank was gone. The particular quality of the silence was what unnerved Helen the most. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house. It was the hollow, echoing quiet of a space that had lost its purpose. For 52 years, this house had been filled with the sounds of Frank. The scrape of his work boots on the mat, the clatter of his tools on the workbench in the garage, the low rumble of his voice as he read the newspaper, commenting on the state of the world as if it were a faulty bit of plumbing he could fix with the right wrench. Helen moved through the rooms like a curator in a museum of her own life. Every object held a ghost. The worn armchair with the indentation perfectly molded to Frank's frame. The shelf of meticulously labeled jars in the pantry, a testament to her own quiet industry. The photographs on the mantelpiece, their wedding stiff and hopeful in black and white. Their son Mark's first steps, a blurry moment of parental triumph. Their daughter Susan's graduation, her smile wide and oblivious to the complexities that lay ahead. The house had been their masterpiece. Frank, a carpenter by trade, had built it with his own hands, pouring the foundation, raising the walls, shingling the roof under a relentless summer sun. Helen, a bookkeeper by training, had managed the ledger, stretching every dollar until it screamed, ensuring that the dream never outpaced the reality of their budget. They were a team. He was the brawn and the structure. She was the planning and the finish. Together, they had built a life as solid and dependable as the oak tree in their front yard. Now, the oak tree was just a tree, and the house was just a collection of wood and nails. Without Frank, it felt like a shell. Mark had started calling more often after the funeral. His calls were slick with a practiced, professional sympathy that felt alien to Helen. Mark was a man who dealt in futures, in acquisitions, in leveraging assets. He lived in a glass tower in a city 3 states away, a world of sharp suits and sharper deals. "Mom, you can't stay in that big house all by yourself," he'd said, his voice smooth and reasonable through the phone line. "It's too much for you. The upkeep, the taxes. It's a liability. Liability." Helen had turned the word over in her mind. This house, this vessel of her entire adult life, was a liability. She looked at the hand-hewn beams in the ceiling, each one bearing the faint marks of Frank's plane, and felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "I'm fine, Mark," she had insisted. "I manage." "But you shouldn't have to manage," he'd countered. "You should be enjoying your golden years. I have a great idea. You sell the house, take the equity, and come live near me. I have a wonderful guest suite in my building. Pool, gym, concierge. You'll be comfortable. I'll take care of everything." The words were a balm, and Helen, raw with grief and exhausted by the sheer effort of waking up each morning in a world without Frank, allowed herself to be soothed. Susan, her daughter, was more hesitant. She lived closer, just a town over, but her life was a whirlwind of her own children and a demanding job. "Are you sure, Mom?" Susan had asked, her brow furrowed with a familiar, anxious concern. "It's all happening so fast." "Mark's right," Helen had said, trying to convince herself as much as her daughter. It's too much house, and I'd be closer to my son. The phrase felt strange on her tongue. She was already close to her daughter, but Susan's life was full. Mark's was conspicuously empty of anyone but himself. Perhaps she thought he was lonely. Perhaps he needed his mother. It was a foolish, maternal hope, the last flicker of an old flame. So the process began. Mark, ever the efficient executive, handled it all remotely. A realtor he knew, a stager who draped their life in neutral-toned throws and meaningless art, and a lawyer who spoke only in clauses and subclauses. Helen felt like a passenger in her own life, swept along by a current she was too tired to fight. She signed the papers where they told her to sign, her signature, once the anchor of her family's finances, now just a squiggle on a dotted line. The house sold quickly, for a price that made the realtor beam and Mark's voice crackle with triumph over the phone. "See, Mom? I told you. A fantastic return. The money is being wired to an account I set up for you. We'll get you moved in no time." She packed her life into boxes. She chose what to keep with the ruthless triage of someone downsizing from a life into a guest suite. Frank's tools were sold to a young carpenter just starting out. The furniture went to a consignment shop. She kept the photographs, her recipe books, and a small box of Frank's most personal belongings. His father's watch, a worn leather-bound copy of Moby Dick, a handful of smooth stones from a beach they had loved. The day of the move arrived. Mark flew in, a whirlwind of expensive cologne and impatience. He rented a large SUV, dismissing Helen's meticulously packed boxes with a wave of his hand. "We'll buy you new stuff, Mom. Better stuff. Lighter. More modern." He spoke of her life's possessions as if they were outdated software. He loaded only 2 of her suitcases into the back of the vehicle. "Just the essentials for now," he said brightly. "The rest can go into storage. We'll sort it out later." They drove for hours. Helen watched the familiar landscape of her life recede in the side view mirror until it was just a green and brown blur. She tried to make conversation, to ask about his work, his life, but his answers were curt, his attention fixed on the navigation screen of his phone. The city skyline rose to meet them, a serrated edge of glass and steel against the gray sky. This was not the world she knew. It was a place of hard angles and reflected light, a place with no room for oak trees or hand-hewn beams. They didn't go to his apartment building. He took an exit that led them into a part of the city that grew progressively grittier. The glass towers gave way to brick buildings stained with soot, the boutique shops to pawn shops and check-cashing stores. He pulled into the parking lot of a sprawling, impersonal bus station. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and despair. "Mark, where are we?" Helen asked, a cold dread beginning to seep through the fatigue. He turned to her, and for the first time, the professional mask dropped. His face was tight, his eyes avoiding hers. He looked like the little boy he used to be when he'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Mom, I need you to listen to me," he began, his voice losing its confident timbre. "There's been a change of plans." He explained it in the bloodless language of a corporate restructuring. His company was transferring him overseas. A huge opportunity. It was happening immediately. There was no time. The guest suite was no longer an option. It was all a terrible inconvenience, really. He made it sound like she was the problem, a logistical snag in his otherwise perfect life plan. "So what am I supposed to do?" Helen's voice was a whisper. The bus station loomed outside the car window, a monument to transit and transients. "I've taken care of it," he said, regaining some of his composure. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "I bought you a ticket to a nice little town. Quiet. Affordable. There's a senior living facility there that has openings. I've wired them the first month's deposit." He was talking about her future as if he were booking a hotel room for a stranger. He handed her the envelope. Inside was a one-way bus ticket to a town she'd never heard of, an estate she'd never visited. And cash. $500. "What about the money from the house?" she asked, her mind struggling to catch up with the velocity of the betrayal. "It's invested," he said quickly. "Tied up. For your future. This is for the best, Mom. A clean break. A fresh start." He got out of the car and retrieved her 2 suitcases from the back. He He placed them on the curb beside her. He looked at her, this woman who had given him life, who had nursed his fevers and celebrated his triumphs, and he saw only a liability. "I'll call you when I'm settled," he said. It was a lie. They both knew it. He didn't hug her. He didn't even touch her. He just got back into the climate-controlled comfort of his rented SUV and drove away, leaving her standing on a stained concrete curb, the roar of departing buses filling the space where her son used to be. Helen stood there for a long time, the envelope clutched in her hand. She watched his taillights disappear into the stream of traffic, a final, fading red. The world had not just ended. It had been dismantled, sold for parts, and swept into a corner. She looked down at her 2 suitcases, the sum total of her tangible existence. She opened the envelope again. The bus ticket, the $500. She reached into her purse and opened her wallet. A $10 bill, a 5 and 2 ones. $17. The money from the house was gone. Her son was gone. Her home was gone. She was 76 years old, standing alone at a bus station in a strange city with $517 and a ticket to nowhere. The first wave of shock gave way to a cold, terrifying clarity. She was utterly, completely alone. The dread was a physical thing, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The noise of the station, the shouts, the hiss of air brakes, the endless announcements, all faded into a dull roar. In that moment, Helen became invisible. She was just another old woman, another piece of forgotten luggage on the platform of life. She did not take the bus. The ticket felt like a brand, a one-way path to the slow, anonymous death her son had planned for her. To get on that bus would be to accept his verdict. It would be an admission of defeat. Some small, stubborn part of her, the part that had balanced Frank's books to the penny, the part that had canned 300 jars of tomatoes every summer, refused. It was not a spark of hope. It was the cold, hard ember of pure refusal. She spent $17 on a taxi. She asked the driver to take her to the nearest cheap motel. The word cheap felt like a stone in her mouth. The motel was a long, low building with a flickering neon sign that promised color TV, as if it were still 1975. The man behind the plexiglass window took her cash and slid a key attached to a large plastic fob across the counter without making eye contact. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach. The bedspread was thin and covered in cigarette burns. The window looked out onto a brick wall. Helen locked the deadbolt and the chain. She sat on the edge of the stiff mattress and did not move for a very long time. The silence in this room was different from the silence in her house. This was the silence of anonymity, the quiet of a place where no one knew her name and no one cared. She didn't cry. The betrayal was too vast, too clinical for tears. Tears were for scraped knees and broken hearts. This was an amputation. A core part of her had been severed, and she was just staring at the wound, marveling at the clean, surgical precision of the cut. She stayed in that room for 2 days. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't open the curtains. She lived on the stale crackers and a bottle of water she had in her purse. Her world had shrunk to the size of this musty, $20 a night box. The $500 her son had given her felt like blood money. To spend it felt like complicity. But the motel clerk would come knocking soon. The money was a countdown clock. On the 3rd day, a new feeling began to push through the shock. Anger. It wasn't a hot, raging anger. It was a cold, quiet, calculating anger. It was the anger of a bookkeeper who has discovered a catastrophic error in the ledger. The numbers didn't add up. The injustice of it was a mathematical impossibility that had to be rectified. She knew calling the police was useless. What would she say? My son, the successful executive, has stolen my life savings and abandoned me. As the desk sergeant at the local precinct had told her, with a sigh that suggested he'd heard it all before, "Ma'am, it sounds like a family matter," he had directed her to Adult Protective Services, a bureaucratic maze she had no energy to navigate. She knew, with the chilling certainty of someone who had just seen the true face of the world, that the system was not designed to protect her. It was designed to process her. She needed a plan. Frank had always said, when the wood is rotten, you don't patch it. You replaced the whole beam. Her life structure was rotten to the core. She needed a new beam. She left the motel, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight. Her first stop was the public library. It was a solid, old building of brick and granite, a sanctuary of silence and order. It felt safe. It felt sane. She found an empty corral with a public access computer. The hum of the machine was a comforting sound. For years, she had managed their finances on a similar machine, a world of numbers and columns that always had a balance. She didn't know what she was looking for. She typed the name of the town on her unused bus ticket into the search bar. Salinger, Oregon. Population 2,300. A handful of pictures showed a quaint main street and a lot of trees. It looked like a place where people went to disappear. She imagined the senior living facility her son had chosen for her. A clean, beige room, 3 meals a day. The slow, orderly march towards the inevitable. Her spirit recoiled from the image. Out of a habit born from decades of thrift, she navigated to a website she and Frank used to browse together, a government surplus auction site. They had once bought a used commercial-grade saw for his workshop for 1/10 of its value. It was a game they played, finding treasure in other people's cast-offs. She scrolled through listings for office chairs, filing cabinets, and decommissioned police cars. It was a pointless, nostalgic exercise, a way to feel close to Frank for a moment. And then she saw it. Tucked between a listing for a lot of 50 used traffic cones and a diesel generator was a single, bizarre line item. For sale, 1 Pullman passenger car, 1948 model. Steel-sided. As is, where is. Condition, poor. Location, Salinger, or rail siding, spur 3-inch. The starting bid was $100. The buy it now price was $500. Helen stared at the screen. A train car. A rusted, forgotten metal box sitting on a dead-end track in the exact town her son had intended to be her final stop. The absurdity of it was staggering. It was a joke the universe was telling at her expense. But the bookkeeper in her saw something else. It was an asset, a tangible object. It was property. It was junk, yes, but it was junk that you could stand inside of. It was a roof. It was a wall. She clicked on the single, blurry photo attached to the listing. The car was long and green, its paint faded and peeling, its windows either broken or boarded up. A long gash of graffiti marred its side. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb. Any sane person would have closed the browser and walked away. Any sane person would have taken the $500 and bought a ticket on the next bus to anywhere else. But Helen was no longer sane in the conventional sense. The trauma of the past week had burned away all the layers of convention and propriety. She was operating on a different level of logic now, the desperate calculus of survival. She thought about the motel room, that suffocating little box. She thought about the beige room waiting for her in the senior facility. Those were prisons. This train car, this was something else. It was a problem to be solved. And Helen was very, very good at solving problems. She looked at the Buy It Now button. $500. Almost every cent she had to her name. It was the most reckless, insane financial decision of her life. She, Helen, the woman who clipped coupons and tracked every penny, was about to spend her entire net worth on a piece of scrap metal. She took a deep breath. She entered the details of the prepaid debit card Mark had so thoughtfully provided. She clicked the button. The screen refreshed. Congratulations. You're the owner of one Pullman passenger car. Helen stared at the words. A strange feeling washed over her. It wasn't joy. It wasn't fear. It was the quiet, terrifying, and exhilarating feeling of taking the wheel. She had just bought herself a home. Or a coffin. The distinction was not yet clear. She printed the receipt, the flimsy piece of paper, her deed to this new, uncertain world. She had a destination now. She had a purpose. She was going to Salinger, Oregon. Not because her son had sent her there to die, but because she had just bought a piece of it. The bus ride to Salinger was a 20-hour journey through the mundane heart of the country. Helen sat by the window, the printed receipt for her train car tucked safely in her purse. She had $47 left. $47 in a train car. The absurdity of her situation was a constant, low-level hum beneath the drone of the bus's engine. Other passengers slept or listened to music or stared blankly at the passing landscape. Helen stared at it with a new intensity. Every dilapidated barn, every rusting piece of farm equipment, every peeling billboard was a lesson in decay and endurance. Salinger was not so much a town as a brief interruption in the endless expanse of forest and farmland. The bus let her off in front of the gas station that also served as the town's post office and diner. 2 suitcases and a 76-year-old woman on the side of the road. A familiar scene, but this time, the context was entirely different. She was not abandoned. She had arrived. She asked the woman behind the diner counter for directions to the rail siding. The woman, who had the weary but kind eyes of someone who has seen it all, looked at Helen's suitcases and then at her face. Spur 3? Honey, there's nothing out there but junk. The line's been dead for 30 years. I know, Helen said. I'm meeting someone. It wasn't a lie. She was meeting her future. The walk was nearly 2 miles, down a cracked asphalt road that eventually turned to gravel. The air was clean and smelled of pine and damp earth. It was a relief after the recycled air of the bus. Her suitcases, which had seemed so light when Mark packed them, now felt like they were filled with stones. She had to stop every 100 yards, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This was the reality of her decision. She was old, and she was tired, but with every painful step, the anger cooled and hardened into something else. Resolve. She found the siding just as the listing described. A single track, overgrown with weeds and blackberry brambles, splitting off from a main line that was itself rusted with disuse. And there it was, her train car. It was worse than the picture. Much worse. The scale of it was overwhelming. It was a giant, 80-foot-long metal beast, slumbering in a grave of weeds. The green paint was a distant memory, mostly obscured by rust that bled down its corrugated sides in long, weeping streaks. The graffiti was uglier and more profane up close. Most of the windows were gone, leaving dark, gaping mouths. It looked haunted. It looked hopeless. Helen put down her suitcases. She had walked 2 miles for this. She had spent her last $500 on this. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. What had she done? This wasn't a home. It was a monument to a terrible, catastrophic mistake. She was a fool, an old, delusional fool. She was about to turn around, to walk back to the road, and stick out her thumb and surrender to whatever fate awaited her, when she heard a voice. That's a whole lot of rust. The voice was gravelly, like stones being tumbled in a can. It came from a man who seemed to materialize out of the landscape. He was tall and wiry, with a shock of white hair that stuck out from under a grimy baseball cap. He wore faded overalls and carried a burlap sack. He had the lean, weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors. Helen was startled, but not scared. There was something in his posture, a kind of weary stillness, that was not threatening. "Yes, it is," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You lost, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He squinted at the train car, then back at her and her suitcases. He was putting the pieces together. "No," Helen said, lifting her chin slightly. "I'm the owner." The man stopped squinting and his eyes went wide. He looked at her as if she had just announced she was the Queen of England. Then he let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated surprise. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head. "I walked this line every day for 10 years. Seen possums, seen deer, seen a couple of kids I had to chase off. Never thought I'd see the owner." He stuck out a calloused hand. "Name's Walt. Walter Kowalski." "Helen," she said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his skin rough as sandpaper. "So," Walt said, hooking his thumbs in his overalls and surveying the wreck. "You gonna live in it?" He asked it as a practical question, not a judgment. "That's the plan," Helen said. Saying it out loud made it feel both more real and more insane. Walt nodded slowly, chewing on the inside of his cheek. He walked the length of the car, tapping on the steel siding with his knuckles, peering into the dark interior through a broken window. He was like a doctor examining a patient. A very, very sick patient. Section. Section, he came back to where she stood. Well, he said, delivering his diagnosis. She's a 1948 Pullman Standard. All steel construction. They built these things like battleships. The frame's probably shot, and the roof's likely leaking like a sieve. The trucks are seized, and the interior is probably full of rats and rot. But, he paused, giving the car a look that was almost affectionate. The bones are good. The bones are good. The words hung in the air, a counterpoint to the overwhelming evidence of decay. It was the same thing Frank would have said about a dilapidated old house. It was a language she understood. Can it be fixed? She asked. Walt looked at her, then at her suitcases, then at the determined set of her jaw. He saw something more than an old woman with a crazy idea. He saw a project. Walt was a retired railroad mechanic. He had spent 40 years of his life keeping these machines running. He knew their secrets, their weaknesses, their strengths. Retirement had not been kind to him. It had taken away his purpose, leaving him with too much time and too many memories. Anything can be fixed, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. Just takes time, money, and a whole lot of work. You got any of those? I have time, Helen said, and I'm not afraid of work. Money is a problem to be solved. Walt liked that. He liked the way she said it. Not, I don't have any, but it's a problem to be solved. It was the answer of a doer, not a dreamer. All right, Helen, he said, dropping his burlap sack with a thud. First things first. We need to get you inside and see what we're really dealing with. The door was jammed shut with rust and time. Walt retrieved a crowbar from his sack, a tool he apparently carried with him on his daily walks, and went to work. The screech of metal on metal was a painful, piercing sound, the shriek of a tomb being forced open. With a final, groaning complaint, the door slid open a few feet, revealing a sliver of profound darkness. The smell hit them first. It was a thick, complex odor of mold, mildew, animal droppings, and the deep, earthy scent of decay. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed and forgotten for a generation. Walt produced a flashlight from another pocket of his overalls. He was a man of infinite practical pockets. He shone the beam inside. The light cut a bright, dancing circle through the gloom, illuminating a scene of utter devastation. The interior was a wreck. The old passenger seats had been torn out, but their skeletal frames remained, jutting from the floor like broken teeth. The walls were covered in a creeping black mold, and the floor was a treacherous landscape of rotting wood, fallen ceiling panels, and years of accumulated debris. In the center of the car, a large puddle of stagnant water reflected the flashlight beam, evidence of the leaky roof Walt had predicted. Yup, Walt said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Just as bad as I thought. Helen stood at the threshold, peering into the abyss. This was her home. This was her $500 kingdom. The bookkeeper in her was screaming, running a frantic, panicked tally of costs. The materials, the labor, the sheer impossibility of it all. But another part of her, the part that had been dormant for so long, was looking at the space, at the high, curved ceiling, at the row of large windows, waiting to be filled with light, at the sheer, unbroken length of it. It was a disaster, but it was a disaster with potential. We'll need to clear it out first, she said, her voice firm, and patch that roof. Walt turned the flashlight beam onto her face. He saw no fear. He saw no regret. He saw a woman who was already making a to-do list. Yes, ma'am, he said, a note of respect in his voice. That we will. That first day set the tone for the weeks that followed. It was a relentless, back-breaking education in the art of reclamation. Walt was the foreman, the teacher, and the muscle. Helen was the apprentice, the project manager, and the unwavering core of the entire operation. They started by clearing out the debris. They filled dozens of garbage bags with sodden plaster, rusted metal, and unidentifiable filth. They shoveled out layers of dirt and grime that had turned to mud on the floor. It was a brutal, disgusting job, but with every shovelful, they were reclaiming the space. They were taking it back from the decay. Walt taught Helen how to use tools she had never held before. a pry bar to rip out the rotten floorboards, a wire brush to attack the rust that seemed to cover every surface, a caulking gun to seal the hundreds of leaking rivets in the steel walls. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to paper and pens, became calloused and strong. She got blisters, and then the blisters turned to calluses. She ached in muscles she didn't know she had, but she never complained. Walt was a man of few words, but he was a gifted teacher. He communicated through action, showing her how to hold a hammer, how to measure a board, how to listen to the sound of an engine to diagnose its problem. He had a profound, intuitive understanding of the physical world, a knowledge that couldn't be learned from books. Their first major victory was the roof. Walt diagnosed the problem. A 30-year accumulation of pine needles and debris had clogged the drainage channels, causing water to pool and rot through the seals. They spent 2 days on top of the car, scraping, cleaning, and applying a thick black sealant that smelled like tar and victory. That night it rained. Helen and Walt sat inside the dark, empty car, listening. They heard the patter of rain on the metal roof, a comforting, rhythmic sound. But they did not hear the drip, drip, drip of a leak. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the sound of a dry ceiling. It was the most beautiful sound Helen had ever heard. Money was a constant pressing issue. Helen's $47 had dwindled to nothing. Walt lived on a small pension and what he could make from selling scrap metal. They were operating on a shoestring budget in a world that required a rope. But their project began to attract a strange kind of attention. Their first ally was Earl Hobbs, the owner of a local hardware store. Earl was a man whose personality was as solid and unadorned as the cinderblock walls of his store. He had watched Helen arrive in town. He had seen her and Walt hauling bags of garbage out of the old Pullman car. He was curious. One afternoon, he drove his pickup truck out to the siding. He found Helen on her hands and knees, scrubbing a section of the floor with a vinegar solution, trying to kill the mold. "Heard you were trying to raise the dead out here," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Just giving a new lease on life," Helen replied, not looking up from her work. Earl looked around at the progress they had made. The car was still a wreck, but it was a clean wreck. It had been swept, scrubbed, and scoured. It was a space that was being fought for. "You need supplies," he said. It wasn't a question. "We need everything," Helen admitted. "But our budget is limited." Earl nodded. "I'll tell you what," he said. "I'll set you up with a line of credit." "Not charity," he added quickly, seeing the look on Helen's face. "Call a contractor's account. You're improving a property, right? Not a business expense. Pay me back when you can. A little at a time. I'm not a bank. I don't charge interest." Helen finally looked up at him. His face was weathered and kind. He wasn't offering her pity. He was offering her professional courtesy. He was treating her not as an old woman in need of a handout, but as a customer, a builder. "Thank you, Earl," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Don't thank me yet," he grumbled, turning to leave. "You haven't seen my prices," but he was smiling. Earl's line of credit was a lifeline. It allowed them to buy the essentials: plywood for the subfloor, insulation to pack the walls against the coming cold, and miles of electrical wire. Walt, it turned out, was a passable electrician, and he began the painstaking process of wiring the car, running conduits along the curved ceiling, and installing junction boxes. They worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by coffee and sandwiches that Helen made on a small camp stove. In the evenings, they would sit outside the car, too tired to talk, and watch the stars come out. The sky above Salinger was a brilliant, inky black, peppered with a dizzying array of stars. In the city, Helen had forgotten that the night sky had depth. During one of these quiet evenings, Walt finally told her his story. He had worked for the railroad his whole life, right there in Salinger. He had been married for 45 years to a woman named Mary. They had a son who lived in California and never called. When Mary died, the silence in his house became unbearable. He sold it and moved into a small apartment above the diner. Walking the tracks was his way of staying connected to his old life, to the world of steel and motion that he understood. He was like the train car itself, retired, forgotten, but with good bones. Helen told him about Frank, about their house, about the life they had built. She told him everything except the part about Mark. The betrayal was still a private, festering wound, a shame she couldn't yet bear to share. As the weeks turned into a month, a strange and wonderful thing began to happen. The train car started to look less like a wreck and more like a home. The new plywood floor was a clean, pale yellow expanse. The insulated walls, covered in thin sheets of lawn paneling, were warm and smooth to the touch. Walt had even managed to get some of the windows working, replacing the broken panes with sheets of plexiglass from Earl's store. Light, for the first time in 30 years, streamed into the interior. They partitioned the long space into distinct areas. A small, functional kitchen at one end, with a salvaged sink and a propane-powered stovetop. A living area in the middle, with a wood-burning stove Walt had found in a scrapyard and lovingly restored. And at the other end, a small, private bedroom for Helen. She slept on an air mattress, but it felt more comfortable than the finest bed in the world. It was a space she had earned, a space she had built. Their strange, self-contained world was about to be breached. One evening, as the sun was setting, a battered sedan pulled up at the end of the gravel road. A young woman got out. She was hardly more than a girl, with wide, frightened eyes and a belly that was unmistakably pregnant. She stood by her car for a long time, looking at the train car as if trying to work up the courage to approach. Helen walked out to meet her. The girl flinched when she got close, like a stray animal that expects to be kicked. "Can I help you?" Helen asked gently. The girl, whose name was Maya, told her story in a torrent of whispered words. She was running from a boyfriend who had a temper, from a family that had turned its back on her. She had heard a rumor in town, a crazy story about an old woman living in a train car. She had nowhere else to go. She was out of gas and out of options. Helen looked at this girl, so young and so terrified, and she saw a reflection of her own desperation from just a few weeks before. She saw the same fear, the same feeling of being utterly alone in the world. Without a moment's hesitation, Helen said, "Well, you're here now. Come on inside. I'll make you some tea." Maya was their first resident. She took over a small section of the car that they curtained off for privacy. She was quiet and shy, but she was a hard worker. She helped Helen with the painting, her small, steady hands perfect for the detailed work around the windows. She had a knack for growing things, and she started a small herb garden in pots outside the door. The arrival of Maya changed the dynamic of the project. It was no longer just about Helen's survival. It was about creating a sanctuary, a place for the broken and the lost, a place where the world's discarded people could find a home. A few weeks after Maya came Leo. Leo was 17, a skinny, punk kid with a shock of purple hair and a face full of piercings. He had been kicked out of his home in the next town over when his parents found out he was gay. He had been sleeping in the woods, stealing food to survive. He stumbled upon the train car one night, drawn by the light from the windows and the smell of wood smoke. Walt wanted to chase him off. He saw a troublemaker, but Helen saw a scared, hungry kid. She invited him in and gave him a bowl of soup. He ate like a starving wolf, not saying a word. When he was finished, he looked at her, his tough guy, facade crumbling, and asked if he could stay, just for the night. Leo stayed for more than a night. He was sullen and sarcastic, but he was also smart and surprisingly strong. He became Walt's unofficial apprentice, hauling lumber, digging trenches, and absorbing everything the older man taught him. He and Walt developed a grudging, affectionate rapport, a constant back and forth of insults that barely concealed a deep, growing respect. And so, the found family grew. The Pullman car, once a symbol of loneliness and decay, was now teeming with a strange, new kind of life. It was a chaotic, jury-rigged, and utterly beautiful ecosystem. Helen was no longer just a survivor. She was a matriarch. The quiet bookkeeper had become the accidental leader of a tribe of misfits. They were a self-contained unit, living outside the normal rules of society. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. Their little utopia was built on land that didn't belong to them, in a structure that wasn't zoned for habitation. They were living on borrowed time, and the clock was about to run out. The man from the county arrived on a Tuesday. He drove a white pickup truck with the official seal of Oakley County on the door. He wore a crisp shirt with a name badge that read Bill Peterson. Code enforcement. He had a clipboard in his hand and a look on his face that suggested he derived no joy from his work, but a great deal of satisfaction from doing it by the book. He walked the perimeter of the property, his lips set in a thin, tight line. He took notes. He took pictures. He ignored Helen's polite greeting. He was not there to be friendly. He was there to enforce. Finally, he approached the small porch where Helen, Walt, Maya, and Leo had gathered, a silent, anxious, welcoming committee. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Helen but looking at his clipboard. "I'm Bill Peterson, Oakley County Code Enforcement. We've received a complaint about an unauthorized dwelling on this property." "A complaint?" Helen asked. "From who?" "That's confidential," he said flatly. "Are you the owner of this structure?" "I am," Helen said. "And are you residing within it?" "We are," Helen said, gesturing to her small family. He made another note on his clipboard. "Well, ma'am, you are in violation of approximately 17 county codes. This is an unzoned, unpermitted, off-grid residential structure. You have no certificate of occupancy, no approved septic system, no sanctioned electrical hookup. This vehicle," he said the word with disdain, "is not a legal residence." He tore a sheet from his clipboard and handed it to Helen. It was a condemnation notice. The bright red letters at the top seemed to shout from the page. It stated that the structure was unsafe and uninhabitable. They had 30 days to vacate the premises, after which the county would seize the property, her train car, and have it removed and scrapped, at her expense. 30 days. The words felt like a death sentence. 30 days to dismantle not just a home, but a community, a life. "But we've made it safe," Helen protested, her voice trembling slightly. "We've done so much work." "Ma'am," Peterson said, with a sigh of practiced impatience. "I'm sure you have. But safe is a word that has a legal definition. And this," he gestured at the beautiful, improbable home they had built, "ain't it? You have 30 days. My advice to you is to start packing." He turned and walked back to his truck, leaving the red-lettered notice in Helen's hand. It felt heavier than any tool she had ever held. The little family stood in silence, the sound of his truck driving away echoing the sound of Mark's SUV, another official, impersonal departure that threatened to shatter her world. The carefully constructed peace of their sanctuary had been broken. The system, with its clipboards and its codes, had found them. The condemnation notice was a cold, hard fact in a world they had built from dreams and salvaged materials. For the first time since they had begun, the project felt doomed. The energy, the defiant optimism that had fueled their work evaporated, replaced by a thick fog of despair. Maya grew quiet and withdrawn, her hands instinctively cradling her belly as if to protect her unborn child from the uncertainty. Leo's sarcastic bravado vanished, leaving behind a scared 17-year-old he really was. Even Walt, the unshakable rock, seemed to drift. He would stare at the train car for long periods, his tools lying idle at his feet. Helen felt the old, familiar feeling of powerlessness creeping back in. The world was once again telling her that she was insignificant, that her efforts were meaningless in the face of its rules and regulations. The 30-day deadline loomed over them like a guillotine. But the bookkeeper in her refused to let the ledger go unbalanced. She had faced ruin before and had found a way through. This was just another, more complicated equation. She took the condemnation notice and, on the back, started a list. It was a list of every violation Peterson had cited. Unauthorized dwelling, no septic, no electrical, no certificate of occupancy. It was a daunting list, a litany of their failures. But to Helen, it was a punch list, a set of problems that needed to be solved. The news of their predicament spread through Salinger with the speed of small-town gossip. But it wasn't the schadenfreude-tinged gossip of a scandal. It was a story of fight. The old woman and the railroad mechanic and their band of misfits against the county. It was a classic underdog story, and the people of Salinger, A town full of fiercely independent and often stubborn individuals knew which side they were on. The first to show up was Earl Hobbs. He drove his pickup out to the siding the morning after Peterson's visit. He found Helen staring at her list. "Heard you had a visit from Billy the Badge," he said, forgoing any pleasantries. "Let me see the ticket." Helen handed him the notice. He read it, his brow furrowed. 17 violations, he whistled. "That's a new record, even for Bill. He's a stickler, but he's not a bad guy. He just really loves rules." "We have 30 days, Helen said, her voice flat. "Then we have 30 days to get to work," Earl said, a determined glint in his eye. "Look at this. No approved septic, what are you using?" "A composting toilet," Walt chimed in from the doorway. "State of the art. No water, no smell." "Well, that's your problem," Earl said. "Bill Peterson doesn't know what a composting toilet is. To him, septic means a concrete tank buried in the ground. We need to get in the paperwork. The manufacturer's specs. Show him it meets environmental standards." He went down the list, translating the bureaucratic jargon into practical problems. "No sanctioned electrical hookup, of course not. You're off-grid. But is your wiring up to code? Is it grounded? Are the breakers right? We need to get a licensed electrician out here to sign off on it." "We can't afford a licensed electrician," Walt grumbled. "Leave that to me," Earl said. "I know a guy who owes me a favor. A big 1-inch. Earl's visit was like a shot of adrenaline. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered a strategy. He turned their death sentence into a checklist. The community, which had been paralyzed by fear, stirred back to life. They had a plan. They had a fight. If you've made it this far in the story, you're invested. You're part of this community now. And I have to ask, what would you do in this position? Would you pack it in, or would you fight? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of stubborn old women and second chances, hit that subscribe button, because this fight is just getting started. Earl was true to his word. The next day, a retired electrician named Sal showed up. He was a grump with a tool belt, but he knew his trade. He spent a full day going over Walt's wiring, pointing out minor infractions, suggesting improvements, and muttering about the shoddy work of amateurs. But at the end of the day, he sat at Helen's small kitchen table and, with a flourish, signed an official-looking document that declared the electrical system of the Pullman car to be safe and up to the standards of the National Electrical Code. He refused any payment, accepting only a cup of coffee and a slice of the banana bread Maya had baked. The pastor from the local church, a young, earnest man named Father Michael, heard the story from Earl. On Sunday, he didn't preach about Scripture. He preached about the Good Samaritan. He preached about a community's responsibility to its neighbors. He didn't mention Helen by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. After the service, he organized a work party. The following Saturday, a caravan of pickup trucks and station wagons made its way down the gravel road to the siding. More than 24 people from the town descended on the train car, armed with paintbrushes, hammers, ladders, and casseroles. It was a remarkable, chaotic, and beautiful day. While a team of men built a proper, sturdy porch to replace the temporary one, a group of women repainted the entire exterior of the car, covering the last vestiges of rust and graffiti with a coat of deep, dignified forest green. Someone else installed real glass in the windows. Another person, a landscape architect, helped Maya and Leo design and build a series of raised garden beds along the track, turning the weed-choked siding into a proper yard. Helen moved through the crowd, a queen in her own kingdom, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. These people, most of whom were strangers, were not just helping her save her home. They were validating it. They were confirming that what she had built was not a violation, but a victory. They saw what she saw, not a piece of junk, but a place of hope. As the work party was in full swing, another car appeared on the road. This one was not a pickup truck. It was a late-model luxury sedan, its polished exterior looking wildly out of place in the dusty, rural setting. A woman got out. She was elegantly dressed, her hair perfectly coiffed. She looked around at the boisterous scene with a mixture of confusion and horror. It was Susan. Helen's daughter had finally found her. A distant cousin had heard the rumors and called her. "I think your mother is living in a boxcar," the cousin had said, her voice dripping with scandalized pity. Susan approached Helen, her face a mask of anxious concern. "Mother? Oh my God, is that you? What is all this? What are you doing?" She looked at Helen's work clothes, her calloused hands, the smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked at the train car, the crowd of strangers, the whole impossible scene. Her eyes filled with tears. "I've been so worried," she said, her voice cracking. "Mark said you were in a nice facility. He said you were happy." "Mark lied," Helen said, her voice even. There was no anger in it, just a simple statement of fact. "I know," Susan whispered. "I try to call him. He's in Singapore or Dubai or somewhere. He won't return my calls. Mom, this has to stop. You can't live like this. It's not safe. It's not respectable." She grabbed Helen's arm. "Come with me. Right now. I'll take you home. My home. The kids miss you. We have a spare room. You can be comfortable." It was the offer Helen had longed to hear for months. An offer of family, of comfort, of a return to her old life. But as she looked at her daughter's frantic, well-meaning face, she realized that she didn't want that life anymore. Her old life was a museum. This chaotic, vibrant, difficult place was her life now. "This is my home, Susan," Helen said, gently removing her daughter's hand from her arm. "These are my people." Susan looked from her mother to Walt, who was standing nearby, his face an unreadable mask of stoicism. She looked at Maya, who was serving lemonade to the painters. She looked at Leo, who was laughing as he helped nail down the last board on the new porch. She didn't understand. She saw a dirty, unconventional, and vaguely dangerous situation. She couldn't see the love. She couldn't see the community. "But what?" Susan asked, her voice full of a pain that was both real and profoundly self-centered. "After everything we've given you, after all Dad and I did for you." The "we" was a slip, a moment of unintentional honesty that revealed her own complicity in the neglect. Helen looked her daughter in the eye. The question she had held inside for so long finally came out. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple request for information, a bookkeeper trying to balance a final, painful column in the ledger. "Where were you, Susan?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. "When Mark left me at the bus station with $17, where were you?" Susan had no answer. Her face crumpled. The shame, the guilt, the months of willful ignorance all crashed down on her at once. She couldn't meet her mother's gaze. She just shook her head, turned, and walked back to her expensive car. She drove away in a cloud of dust and unresolved grief, leaving Helen standing on her new porch, surrounded by her new family. The battle with the county was still ahead, but Helen knew, with absolute certainty, that she had already won the war for her own soul. The next 29 days were a blur of focused, determined activity. The spontaneous work party had lit a fire under the community, but the real work was the slow, tedious process of navigating the bureaucracy. Helen, with her bookkeeper's mind, took the lead. She created a binder. It was a magnificent thing, a 3-inch thick testament to her organizational genius. It had tabs for every violation on the condemnation notice. Behind this septic tab, she filed the manufacturer's specification for the composting toilet, along with a signed affidavit from a professor of environmental science at the State University, a cousin of Earl's, it turned out, testifying to its efficiency and ecological soundness. Behind the electrical tab, she filed Sal's signed inspection report, along with diagrams Walt had drawn of the entire wiring system. Behind the structural integrity tab, she filed a report from a retired structural engineer, the husband of a woman from the church choir, who had inspected the Pullman's steel frame and declared it massively over-engineered for residential purposes and likely to outlast the county courthouse. They addressed every single point on the notice with a mountain of paperwork. They were fighting the system not by breaking its rules, but by overwhelming it with its own language. But one problem remained, the biggest one of all. Unauthorized dwelling on unzoned land, the train car was sitting on property owned by the railroad, a massive, faceless corporation with headquarters 1,000 miles away. They were squatters. It was the one violation they couldn't fix with a work party or an expert opinion. Helen spent days at the library, researching property law, zoning ordinances, and railroad easements. The more she read, the more hopeless it seemed. Then she found it. A tiny, obscure precedent from a case in the 1950s involving a group of miners who had lived in company-owned shacks. The court had ruled that if a structure was permanent in nature and the landowner consented, it could be reclassified. It was a long shot, a legal loophole the size of a pinhole. But it was something. The 30th day arrived. It was a crisp, clear autumn morning. The air was cool, and the trees surrounding the siding were a riot of red and gold. The train car looked magnificent. Its new green paint gleamed in the sun. Real curtains hung in the glass windows. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney of the wood stove. The raised garden beds were neatly tended, and a string of solar-powered lights was draped along the new porch railing. It didn't look like a violation. It looked like a home. At precisely 9 o'clock, Bill Peterson's white county truck pulled up. He got out, clipboard in hand. He was not alone. The complaint and the subsequent community response had made this a high-profile case. His supervisor, a portly man named Henderson, was with him. Peterson stopped in his tracks. He stared at the transformed scene. His mouth, usually set in a firm, thin line, was slightly agape. He was looking at the same train car, but it was not the same place. Helen met them on the porch. She was not alone. Walt stood beside her, his arms crossed. Earl Hobbs was there, leaning against a porch post. Father Michael stood at the bottom of the steps, his presence a quiet statement of support. A small crowd of the townspeople who had helped had gathered at a respectful distance, silent witnesses. Mr. Peterson, Mr. Henderson, Helen said, her voice calm and steady. Welcome back. We've been expecting you. She did not wait for them to speak. She launched into her presentation. If you'll allow me, she said, opening her magnificent binder, I'd like to address the points raised in your notice of condemnation. She took them on a tour. It was not a plea for sympathy. It was a professional presentation. She walked them through the train car, which was now a clean, bright, and livable space. She showed them the kitchen, the bedroom, the common area. Maya and Leo stayed discreetly in the background, a silent testament to the fact that this was more than just a house. It was a home for a family. At each point, Helen would refer to her binder. Regarding violation 73B, lack of an approved septic system, she would say, please refer to tab, which includes the schematics for our Class 4 composting system, certified by the National Sanitation Foundation. Regarding violation 91, uninspected electrical wiring, she would continue, please refer to tab B, which contains the signed and notarized inspection report from Salvatore Marconi, licensed master electrician, license number 734B. She was relentless. She was thorough. She was magnificent. She was a bookkeeper armed with a ledger, and she was going to make it balance. Peterson was speechless. He kept looking from the immaculate train car to his flimsy notice of violation. The world no longer made sense. Henderson, his supervisor, was a politician. He could feel the way the wind was blowing. He saw the crowd. He saw the pastor. He saw a potential public relations nightmare. But he also saw a problem he couldn't easily dismiss. This is all very impressive, ma'am, Henderson said, trying to sound both firm and reasonable. Truly, you've done a wonderful job. But the fact remains, you are illegally squatting on private railroad property in a vehicle that is not and never will be a house. This was the final hurdle, the one Helen couldn't fix with a binder. About that, a new voice said. A woman stepped forward from the crowd. She was in her late 30s, dressed in a sharp business suit that looked as out of place as Susan Sedan had. She carried a leather briefcase. My name is Claudia Torres, she said, handing Henderson a business card. I'm an attorney with the Union Pacific Railroad. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Walt shot Helen a questioning look. Helen gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She had no idea who this woman was. The railroad is aware of the situation, Claudia Torres continued, her voice crisp and professional. Frankly, we're impressed. This Pullman car was a derelict liability on our books. We were slated to spend $20,000 to have it removed and scrapped next year. Ms. Here, she gestured to Helen, not only saved us that expense, she has improved the value of our property. She opened her briefcase. The Union Pacific Railroad has no interest in evicting a 76-year-old woman who has become a local hero. On the contrary, we have drawn up a lease agreement. We are prepared to lease Ms. Helen this plot of land, encompassing the siding and 50 feet on either side, for the sum of $1 per year for the next 99 years. She placed the document on the porch railing. It was thick and official and bound in a blue legal cover. Henderson was flabbergasted. But still a vehicle. It's not a house. And that's the final piece, Claudia Torres said with a smile. According to Oakley County Ordinance 1138, a vehicle can be reclassified as a permanent modular structure if it is affixed to a permanent foundation. Your own crew, Mr. Peterson, she said, nodding towards a new porch, has just witnessed a team of local contractors building and affixing a permanent, code-compliant wooden foundation, also known as a porch, to the structure. It is no longer a vehicle. It is a house. The logic was beautiful. It was absurd. It was legally watertight. They had used the county's own rules, the town's own labor, and the railroad's own self-interest to tie a perfect, inescapable knot. Bill Peterson looked at his supervisor. Henderson looked at the crowd. He looked at the pastor. He looked at the lawyer from the railroad. He looked at Helen, standing tall and proud on the porch of her train car house. He did the only thing a sensible bureaucrat could do. He surrendered. "Well, Bill," he said, clapping his subordinate on the back. "It looks like we have a new taxpayer in Oakley County. Sign the certificate." Bill Peterson, a man who had lived his entire professional life by the book, took out a new form, a certificate of occupancy. He filled it out, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet. He handed it to Helen. Vindication. It was a simple piece of paper, but it was everything. It was a deed. It was a declaration. It was permission to exist. A cheer went up from the crowd. Earl Hobbs let out a whoop. Walt wrapped a surprised Helen in a bear hug, lifting her clean off the porch. The long, impossible fight was over. They had won. The story of the train car, the widow, and the county showdown became a local legend. A reporter from the regional paper got wind of it and wrote a sprawling, human interest piece with a headline, "The Little Engine That Could Be a Home." The story was picked up by a national wire service. For a brief, bizarre moment, Helen, Walt, and their found family were minor celebrities. Donations arrived from strangers. Books, blankets, a small solar panel array that gave them consistent, quiet power. The newfound fame had an unintended consequence. One afternoon, a sleek black rental car, even more expensive than Susan's, pulled up to the siding. A man in a tailored suit got out. It was Mark. He had seen the story online. He looked different, thinner, more tired. The corporate swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. He carried a bouquet of gas station flowers. He found Helen sitting on her porch, reading a book. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant. Helen looked up. She felt a flicker of the old pain, but it was distant now, like a phantom limb. She felt mostly pity. "Mark," she said. It wasn't a question. "This is incredible," he said, looking around at the thriving homestead. The garden was flourishing. A second train car, a baggage car they had bought from the railroad for another $1, was being converted into a workshop and a larger living space for Maya and her soon-arrived baby. "I saw the article. You're famous." He tried for one of his old, charming smiles, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mom, we could franchise this. Think about it. Railcar Living. A whole chain of boutique retirement communities. We could make a fortune. I've already drawn up a business plan." He was trying to sell her. After everything, he was still trying to leverage her life for his own gain. He still saw her not as a person, but as an asset. Helen closed her book. She looked at this strange man who was her son, this man who had tried to erase her. She felt no anger. She felt no desire for revenge. She felt only a great, yawning emptiness where her love for him used to be. Walt appeared at the door behind her, a silent, solid presence. "This is not for sale, Mark," Helen said, her voice quiet but utterly final. "Not now. Not ever." The rejection finally seemed to land. The slick salesman facade crumbled completely, revealing the small, selfish man underneath. He looked lost. "But what about the money from the house?" he stammered. "It's gone. The deal in Singapore. It fell through. I lost everything." So that was it. The final truth. He hadn't come back for her. He had come back for a bailout. "That sounds like a family matter," Helen said, echoing the words of a long-ago police sergeant. She stood up and went inside, leaving him alone on the gravel path. He stood there for a few moments, the flowers wilting in his hand, then got back in his car and drove away. She never saw him again. A week later, Susan returned. She didn't come in a fancy car. She came in a rented moving truck. She didn't offer excuses or pleas. She just opened the back of the truck. It was filled with Helen's old life. The boxes she had so carefully packed. Frank's toolbox. The photographs from the mantelpiece. The worn armchair. "I went to the storage unit," Susan said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I paid the back fees. I thought you might want these." It was an apology. A real one. An act of contrition. Helen looked at the contents of the truck, the ghosts of her past life. For a moment, she was tempted to tell Susan to take it all away. But then she looked at her daughter's face, at the genuine remorse in her eyes. "The coffee is on," Helen said, holding the door to the train car open. "Come on in." The healing was not instantaneous. It was slow and quiet, like the garden taking root. Susan started visiting every other weekend. She brought her children, who were initially wary of the strange train car home, but soon fell in love with it. With Uncle Walt, who taught them how to whittle, with Maya, who let them feel the baby kick, and with Leo, who showed them how to build a proper campfire. They were rebuilding their family, one visit at a time. Life on the siding settled into a new, sustainable rhythm. Maya gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, who they named Hope. Leo finished his high school degree online and started working part-time for Earl at the hardware store, discovering a surprising passion for plumbing fixtures. Walt and Helen, the unlikely partners, became the quiet, steady center of this new universe. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, Helen and Walt sat together on the porch. The air was cool, and the sounds of their small community filled the silence. Hope's soft gurgling from the annex car, the low murmur of Leo and Maya talking by the fire pit, the gentle clink of Susan washing dishes in the kitchen. Walt had salvaged the old armchair from the storage truck. It sat on the porch, a comfortable, familiar presence. Helen reached over and placed her hand on its worn arm, the fabric smooth as an old memory. On the windowsill inside, next to a pot of thriving basil, sat a small, framed photograph of her and Frank on their wedding day. Young, stiff, and full of a future they could never have imagined. She looked out at the world she had built from the wreckage of her old one. A home made of steel and resilience. A family forged in shared desperation and mutual respect. A garden growing in the unlikeliest of soil. "You know," Walt said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad that County Man showed up." Helen smiled. "Why is that?" "Because," he said, looking out at the lights twinkling in the windows of their little kingdom, "it's one thing to build a house. It's another thing entirely to build a home that the rest of the world has to admit is real." Helen looked at the tracks stretching out before them, disappearing into the darkness. They were rusted and unused, a path from a forgotten past. But for her, they had not been an end. They had been a destination. The journey had been long and the route unplanned, but the train had finally arrived at its station.